Hey, hello, and welcome to 1 Samuel 26. Now, in this chapter, some men from the town of Ziph go to Saul and tell him where David is hiding. And so Saul takes his standing army of 3,000 men who are always with him and immediately goes in pursuit of David. Now, remember, David has only 600 men, so the odds are terrible, 5-1 against David. But as we shall see, God is with David to protect him. Now, when David hears that Saul is searching for him, he makes a reconnaissance mission. And seeing that Saul and his army are sleeping, he hatches a bold plan. Taking 2 of his men, he goes down into Saul's sleeping army and he finds Saul asleep. Let's read verses 8 and 9. Then Abishai said to David, "Today God has delivered your enemy into your hand. Now therefore, please let me strike him with a spear to the ground with one stroke, and I will not have to strike him the second time." But David said to Abishai, "Do not destroy him, for who can stretch out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be without guilt?" David's loyal friend and relative Abishai recognizes a golden opportunity to save David by killing his enemy. But David stops him. You see, David lived his life by principle, not mere opportunism. David's men were eager to seize this golden opportunity to rid David of a threat. But David knew that some seemingly golden opportunities are actually tests. David's men urged him to kill Saul, but David feared the Lord. And he understood that he should not remove the man that God himself had chosen and anointed to be Israel's king. Only God could do that. Only God could remove Saul and replace him with another of his choosing. Although David was anointed to be king, he chose to wait on the Lord's timing and method to bring him to the throne. David's life was not determined by open doors of opportunities, but by God's word, by his principles, and by God's Spirit. You know, some opportunities can seem just too good to be true. A person may be offered a job or a business opportunity that seems like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, but it may involve becoming yoked with people who aren't godly in their business practices. And if you seize that opportunity, it may get you into real trouble. Maybe you're offered a ministry opportunity or a relationship that seems really appealing. But if you rush into it and compromise biblical principles, it can take you out of God's will and bring you heartache. Now, God tests us to see whether we're going to live by our own understanding and desires or live by principle and be led by God. Let's read what happens in verse 12. So David took the spear and the jug of water from beside Saul's head, and they went away, but no one saw or knew it had happened. Nor did anyone wake up. Now here it comes. For they were all asleep because a sound sleep from the Lord had fallen on them. Now the truth is that God was with David and protected David, but that did not give him a green light to kill Saul. And so David merely temporarily took Saul's spear and jug of water. And after they got safely away, David calls out to the camp from a safe distance. And he shows Saul's belongings to prove that although he had the opportunity to kill Saul, he had no intention to harm him. Then David says these words. Let's read along verse 19. Now therefore, please let my lord the king listen to the words of his servant. If the Lord has stirred you up against me, let him accept an offering. But if it is men, then cursed are they before the Lord. Now you see, David knows that Saul is God's chosen instrument to defeat Israel's enemies, to deliver God's people, and to punish those who do wickedness. And in fact, Saul had done that pretty well, particularly in the case of the Philistines. So David says in essence, if in fact God has found sin in me, and he has stirred you up as his agent to punish me, then let me offer up a sacrifice to the Lord that I might receive the Lord's forgiveness. But if instead the motive to kill me arose from a human source, then let the judgment and punishment fall upon them. And that, of course, would have been Saul. But in verse 21, Saul escapes that judgment by repenting and confessing his sin of seeking to kill David. He says, quote, "I have sinned. I have played the fool, and I have committed a serious error." Now in verse 19 and 20, David makes an important point about those who had chased him out of Israel, and I don't want us to miss this. Beginning in the second half of verse 19. "For they have driven me out today, so that I would have no attachment with the inheritance of the Lord, saying, 'Go and serve other gods.' Now then, do not let my blood fall to the ground away from the presence of the Lord." You see, Israel alone, out of all the nations, was in covenant with God. Their laws, their customs, and culture came from the true God. All other nations, they worship false gods, pagan gods. So their laws, custom, and culture were pagan, immoral, and idolatrous. Only within Israel could you live under God's laws and culture and thereby enjoy his blessings. Only in Israel could you participate in Yahweh worship at the temple and participate in the festivals led by God's chosen priests. Now, to be driven into a pagan land meant that you would live under pagan laws and customs. And living under the laws and customs of a foreign God is a form of being forced to serve that God. Being driven out denied David the opportunity of living before God's jurisdictional presence in Israel. Now, in the same way, people who follow secular or worldly practices and customs, views, and politics are living away from the presence of God. This is true even if they call themselves Christian. Every religion produces a culture, and the secular and New Age movements in America are religions, and they have produced their own culture. And you serve the God or the religion of whichever culture you choose to follow. To live in the presence of God, we must live under biblical truths and be led by the Spirit. Now, in the final verse of our chapter, David and Saul part company, and they will never see each other again. This story, as well as the story of En-Gedi in chapter 26, teaches us an important principle about how we are to treat authorities. David respected the authority that God had given Saul. He realized that by striking down Saul, he would be striking at God. Saul, for all his faults, was a chosen instrument by which God was bringing deliverance and protection to his people Israel. God had elevated Saul, and it was God's place alone to remove him. And so David did not retaliate, even though he was unfairly treated. Even today, how many of you know God is represented by and uses very imperfect people to accomplish his purposes? And so we must treat with honor those he has chosen to represent them. God bless you. Have a wonderful day and walk with the Lord.